welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hi, welcome to Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. I am Jessica, and I'm here with Lisa Williamson Rosenberg, who wrote this book, Mirror Me, which I can't even really put into words. It was just such a layered book. In some ways, I would call it a psychological thriller. In other ways, it's almost like a study in just like humanity in general. And it dives deep into all sorts of topics, mental health and race and religion and just identity in general, and also nature and nurture. And that's all I'm really going to do right now with describing it, because I would like to welcome Lisa.
Jessica, thank you so much. It is really great to be here.
So it is wonderful to have you. Tell us a little bit about Mirror Me and where the story came from for you.
I started this book in 2009, and it was a totally different kind of thing. The original title was Acid Shabbat. If you can see how many steps removed from that, it started out as like Eddie was sort of a side character and a ne'er-do-well brother-in-law in love with his brother's then wife. They were a little older at that point. But Mirror Me, the concept came from a novel I wrote a long time ago called Birchwood Doll. And it centered a biracial ballerina similar to Lucy, who's the kind of, I don't want to call her a love interest in this book because she sort of is and sort of isn't. But Birchwood Doll was sort of an autobiographical thing, and the main character was inspired kind of by my own life. And when it was done, I submitted it. It got really close to getting an agent, and it won. It was a finalist in the Nielsen Unpublished Novel Award, but it didn't get me what I wanted. It didn't get me the agent or the deal or all that. So I'm still addicted to these characters, so I started writing a sequel. Eddie was, like I said, a side character, ne'er-do-well brother-in-law. He trips on acid and goes to a Shabbat dinner, and like all kinds of crazy stuff happened. And that made me more interested in him. Like, wait, who is he? And why is he like me? And it pulled me away from whatever, I can't even remember what that novel was going to be about, because Eddie just captured my attention. And I sort of put everything I know about sort of existing in a body into him, except for the fact that he's male. And there's a very specific reason why I made him male and not female, because he's sort of buffeted by life. And I've been to I've done a lot of, writers' workshops where you're never supposed to have a passive main character. And he's not passive, but he is somewhat borrowing his body and borrowing himself and not entirely in it. Anyway, that's where he came from and how I got interested in who is this guy and why does he have anxiety and why does he not quite fit in any place? And then sort of he came to me swimming, and that the water was a place. And I know for a lot of people, being in the water is a place where it's safe and comfortable. And he had that too, but I brought him back to sort of his origins in actually the womb. And that kind of gets into what the story is. It's an unconventional book and it's hard to describe, but it is, I think, psychological suspense. There's a little magical realism in it. It's the story of Eddie Asher, a young guy who's biracial, of Swedish and African descent, and his birth mother never asked his birth father what country in Africa he was from. So there's that little nebulous piece of his Black identity that you can't define. Anyway, he's adopted by a white Jewish family raised in the 70s on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, as was I. And so he suffers from memory lapses. And these memory lapses are kind of responsible for the initial crisis that opens the book when he's a young adult already. He believes that he has pushed his brother's fiance, Lucy, onto the subway tracks. And he loves Lucy. Lucy is somebody who's very close to him. She's also biracial, and they have this intense kinship. Um, and he doesn't believe that he would do such a thing, but he's holding the feathers from her hat, and he's got no other explanation. So he checks into a mental institution to find out what actually happened. And his memories, he meets Dr. Montgomery, who is a specialist in multiple personality disorder. Montgomery triggers his memories that kind of set off kind of the flashbacks and the other perspective. And the main narrator of the story is called Pear. And Pear is this disembodied consciousness that Montgomery thinks is a multiple, is kind of an alter ego. But he's a disembodied consciousness who lives in a scar on Eddie's right shoulder. And he's been witness to Eddie's entire life from basically conception on. He's an unreliable narrator. We don't know exactly who he is. All we know is that Pear knows Eddie better than Eddie. And Pear has taken the Swedish name that Eddie's birth mother would have given him. So it's spelled P-A-R with an umlaut over the A. The book is told between Pear's perspective and Eddie's perspective. And after a while, you realize Pear has memories that aren't Eddie's, that belong to somebody else.
That's really where, some of the mystery comes in, because I think like it is a really interesting concept. And part of the thing that's wonderful about this book is you do think it's going in one direction, and it takes you on a weaving narrative. Who is you wanted to know who Eddie was. Well, the reader wants to know who Eddie is. They want to know who Pear is. They want to know who Lucy is. And it's never a clear answer until the end, when certain things kind of fall out. But I thought that it was a really good just character study, and I felt that while I was reading it, in the beginning, it seems clear, okay, here's Eddie. So Pear is like his other, but then, when you listen to Pear talk, things don't add up 100%.
Right.
And part of, I think, the experience with this being psychological suspense is, as a reader, you're trying to sort of go about, number one, like what we know now about multiple personality disorder, which I believe is now called dissociative
identity disorder.
Yes.
Right. Absolutely. And that changed in 1994.
Which is like this. So that was that. Yes, exactly. That was my other question. This book takes place in the early 90s.
1993. Right.
Yes.
1993. And Dr. Montgomery is apparently on the committee to change multiple personality disorder. So that's his field. But what Pear's job is similar to dissociative identity disorder. He announces to the reader, I filter out what I don't think Eddie can handle. But because he can filter out what he doesn't think Eddie can handle, he can also tell Eddie what he wants Eddie to believe and confuse him. So but at the very beginning, and then we go backwards, but at the beginning, Pear is discovering that maybe Eddie is not as feeble as he thought Eddie was. And there are chapters in the book where they switch in, and each of them has their alternate chapter, and it starts mid-sentence while Montgomery is in the middle of asking a question, and both Eddie and Pear have to kind of get their bearings. Wait, who is he talking to, and what does he mean? And Eddie is without a voice, so Eddie needs to write his responses down on a yellow legal, I think it's yellow, on a yellow legal pad. including when he gets very angry, he has to kind of write it because he's got no voice, and he's strapped down and he doesn't understand why or who was violent, me or Pear. I always think of Pear as Eddie's own personal Greek chorus. And I always, whenever you read, you think of the narrator, like, who is that narrator and how do they know what they know? So I literally gave him a physical, and it's more, okay, you suspend disbelief, and it's, yeah. We've got Nurse Silvana, who's like my own little Nurse Ratchet, who comes in every time something goes wrong. She comes running in with a syringe. Uh, so so there's this unknown, who am I, for both Pear and Eddie at the beginning, and then you go back to childhood when Pear was more of an observer and a protector.
So when you're writing the childhood, you wrote a bit about Eddie's adoption by a white Jewish family, and sort of how that shapes his
Yeah.
identity in general. Do you want to just talk a little bit about that part of the story?
Okay, so I know Eddie's apartment that he grew up, like he lives in my friend's house, in my friend's apartment and my friend's building. Um, his mother, Joanne, is based on my friend's mother, not my mother, even though I was raised by a Black father and a Jewish mother. My parents, biological parents. I was not adopted, but I do know what it's like to look like me, and I look Black. I know our viewers, our listeners can't really see what I look like, but I'm a darker skinned, more Black presenting biracial person, and my mother was Jewish, so I know what it was like to kind of go through the world, under the umbrella of her whiteness. But when she lets go of my hand, I'm a Black child alone, and she's a white woman alone. And also from my father, I got certain things about Black culture that Eddie didn't get. And later on, you meet the Winter family, and I gave the Winter family all the artwork that was on, the Elizabeth Catlett and Charles White, and Ernest Critchlow. I gave all the artwork that was on my parents' walls because my parents were friends with these artists, kind of the Black literati, and I put that on the walls at the apartment that belongs to the Winters, who kind of this family who brings Black culture in, for Eddie, and also another character, Anders, who comes up later. So I wanted Eddie to kind of have that sort of otherness, and then different from my experience, he's Black. He's Black visibly. He's Swedish, he knows, because all he knows is that his birth mother was Swedish, and too young to raise a baby, and that she was tall and blonde, like his psychiatrist, and he kind of does this mental conflation of his psychiatrist. And I wanted him to be a mix of these things, but removed from both sides, and when he says to his mother, when he talks to his mother about being Black, she dismisses it and says, "You're not Black and I'm not white. We're just a mother and a son who love each other very much." And she's trying to erase their differences in what she believes is a very kind way. But what that makes Eddie is confused and more alone. And, she's much more affectionate with him in public than she is with his brother, who's the biological son of the Asher family. And she explains, well, I want them to know you're mine. I want them to know. It's almost a demonstration to the world that they're together, but it's also an erasure of Eddie's identity. And that goes into the complication. And later he meets Lucy, who happens to also be biracial and also Jewish, but her background is very, very different from his. She's the first woman who shares this with him, who he meets, and he feels very drawn to her right away and very connected to her. And he notices traits they have in common, not just their brown skin, but also that they both are, kind of slightly built, but they have big hands, and they both chew their fingernails. So he looks at their hands on the table side by side, and for the first time, somebody matches him. So that's kind of leads to their friendship. So he's always searching. Eddie is searching for an other who makes him feel validated, different from Pear, who's this other who's a mystery.
And Lucy in general remains a mystery for the majority of the book. You learn more about her, but just about, the thing that Eddie believes he has done, which causes him to check himself
Yeah.
into this psychiatric hospital. That's also part of the mystery, and that was also
Right.
really well drawn. I do want to come back and just ask, why 1993 specifically? Why did you want the story set then?
So I think I told you I started writing this book in 2009. Um, and I really struggled with the mysteries and like, how is that a mystery? How is that the point? Why don't they just Google it? Well, why doesn't she just look him up on Facebook? Why doesn't he find out on, why doesn't he do it? Yeah, so that that answers your question. And as soon as I decided, okay, why don't I orient Eddie not just, geographically in the city where I grew up, and in New York City where I grew up, and Seattle, the Pacific Northwest Ballet where I danced, Chicago I threw in there because that's where my family's from. But why don't I orient him in time? And I have him born the same year I was born, a couple months older, because I know what it's like to be a child in New York, to be a biracial child in New York City in the 1970s, a 20-something-year-old person in Brooklyn in the 1990s, and then there's no internet. And there are payphones and all of these things that are really great tools for a mystery. All of I mean, not that it's, I'm not talking about mystery in terms of genre. I'm talking about the secrets. And I was able to reveal and conceal as I saw fit because nobody could just say, oh, I'll look it up. They queef. And
Yeah.
some of the fun has gone out of life. We don't have to kind of scratch our heads and try to remember things like, oh, who was the guy who was in that film? Oh my God, it was on the tip of my tongue. Google it. But so we don't do that in this book. That's why, and as soon as I decided to set the book back 30 years, that was when I was able to finish it. As otherwise, I was like, okay, so she gets on this train or she's killed by this train. So you don't know what happens. And I don't know if that's a spoiler too. It's very hard not to spoil your own book when you talk about
Yeah, I could hear that for sure,
yeah.
definitely. And also, like
Especially, yeah.
we've mentioned, this is a difficult book, but it's to talk about, but it's so
Yeah.
layered and it's really good. I
Thank you.
thank you so much
Mhm.
for chatting about it. I really want to tell readers, if this interview seems cryptic, that is on purpose because a
Mhm.
lot of the, reading this book, really getting into it is figuring out where the puzzle pieces come together. Where does Eddie fit in with Lucy? Where does Pear fit in with all of them? And what exactly is going on and what went on in the past. Again, it's so
Mhm.
layered. There's so much about just identity and about where people fit in society and what, who your kindred spirits are. It was a
Mhm.
really great book. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Are you reading anything right now that you enjoy?
Right now, I am reading The Love Elixir of Augusta Stern by Linda Loigman Cohen, and it is so much fun. It's a wonderful history. Um, Before that, I read the Colored Television by Danzy Senna, which is also incredible, and I would recommend those. I'm drawing a blank. I think one of my favorite books that I read this year was Rachel Kong's Real Americans, which is another like family saga, mysteries of identity and racial like complication and stuff like that.
Thank you so, so much. So this was Jessica with Syosset Libraries Turn the Page podcast. I was here with
Lisa Williamson Rosenberg, and thank you again so much for having me. I appreciate it a lot.
And we are going to close this chapter of Turn the Page.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.